My name is Malcolm Bisby. I've been interested in industrial history for many years, and as a personal initiative, I've done extensive research into the story of the finding of a high-grade form of ironstone in the Rosedale Valley, and found it such a fascinating story. I felt it would be worth sharing with others, and I've made a series of 4 DVDs from talks I've given at village halls. Talk 2 will follow the track route across North York Moors to a place known as Blakey Junction, where we'll branch off and deal with the mining operation in Farndale, known as the Blakey Mines, but actually on the Farndale side. And then we'll come to Blakey Junction and we'll journey on to the site of the deposit of the high-grade ironstone at a place known as Hollins Mines near Banktop. Right, welcome everyone. We left part 1 at the Rudland Rig route. The railway crossed the Rudland Rig route, and this was an ancient waymarker. Now this is part of the Rudland Rig walk, and I just want to show you this because, you know, we're looking at an elevation of over 1,300 feet above sea level. This, believe it or not, was a very busy thoroughfare. It came up from Kirby Moorside, Bransdale, and it travelled all the way down to Ingleby, Greenhouse and Stokesley. The drovers used it, horse-drawn traffic and all sorts. And you can imagine, this was taken on a fine day, but imagine on dark winter days, you're halfway through your walk to Stokesley or back to wherever, and a storm brews up, a snowstorm, a blizzard or whatever. You know, it was a life-threatening situation, but nevertheless, this was a really busy thoroughfare. And this is the route up from, you know, Bransdale, Kirby Moorside, and this is the actual crossing point. This is the railway track, the section of the Rosedale Railway. Now, it was quite ironic in a way that none of the railway on the moortop was fenced at all. The sheep were just free to roam, and some were killed, of course. They roamed onto the track when there was a mineral train which couldn't stop, and sheep were killed and compensation had to be paid. But there was no fencing there. But yet, here, this crossing point, they had 2 bit of fencing and 2 crossing gates to control the traffic, the pedestrian and horse-drawn traffic coming up here when trains were running across this section here. So this was the Bloworth, sometimes referred to as Blowath or Blowith. Bloworth seems to be the more common one. The loneliest crossing gatekeeper's cottage in Britain, I would suggest. So here are the crossing gates, and this is a section of the railway line. And of course, you can imagine that bleak spot, no trees, no protection whatsoever. You can imagine the winter winds and the snowstorms and goodness knows what. But people were happy to live up there. It was amazing. And if you'd been coming up from Bransdale or Kirby Moorside up to that crossing point, this is a typical sight you would have seen, a train passing by, and that's the scene, that exact same scene today. So it's amazing when you walk this track bed today, it's hard to imagine what was going on up there. It was a hive of industry, families lived up there, children went to school. Initially, the children who were in the cottages at Incline Top, there were 4 cottages, and this crossing gatekeeper's cottage, which was, you know, it was divided into 2 families lived there. Their children initially, when the railway first began operation in 1861, the children went by train in the brake van to Farndale and were boarded out, went to school in Farndale, were boarded out for the week and came back on the Friday back to their homes. That was the the way it operated in the beginning. In later years, it changed, and the children walked down 4 miles down to Ingleby School every day and 4 miles back in all weathers. You can't imagine it, can you? So here we are on the track bed. Now, this area here, which was clearly utilised by the rail company for probably a short siding and storage and whatever, we believe that initially, when the line was being constructed by the railway navvies, that they had their sort of encampment there. Now, if it was a deluxe form of accommodation, it would be this form of accommodation, a hut on wheels towed by horses into whatever location. These were often used by road menders. And I remember I was an evacuee during the war out in the country, and I remember one of these things being towed behind a steamroller for a group that were road menders. So I've actually seen one of these in operation. But of course, it was totally impractical to have these towed up onto the moor. So the navvies would have to make their own literally make their own accommodation. They either built crude wooden huts or they made a turf, what they call turf huts. They literally dug out turf from the moor, piled it up, put some timbers over the top and some sheeting, a window and a stove in the middle, and that was their accommodation. And these huts could accommodate, easily 10 people, sometimes 15 people. You can imagine what the atmosphere was like. And these things here, bunk beds, of course, probably four high, and there'd be up to 10 people, 10 navvies in these. And you can imagine, they come in, hard physical work, stale sweat, no showers, no luxuries at all, no baths or anything. You can imagine what the atmosphere would be like in here. But that was their life, and it was a tough life. The story of the navvies is really an incredible story. The suffering, the exploitation, just unbelievable what they went through and what they achieved. And funnily enough, the best railway navvies in the world were rated to be the British navvies. And of the best of the British navvies, the Yorkshire navvies were supposed to be the very best. But the Yorkshire navvies were the biggest troublemakers. They were the riot makers, and the Irish, who get the tarnished name that they were the leaders of all these navvy riots, were really all wanting a relatively quiet life and really wanted to send their earnings back to Ireland. And it was the Brits, especially the Scots and the Yorkshire people, who were the real problem. I mean, they'd get blind drunk, and it was literally a case of call the troops out, because they were virtually uncontrollable. But they were being terribly exploited. This is, it's called a Tommy ticket. And what was happening with the contractors, they were being exploited. They earned good money, relatively, we're talking in relative terms, very good money, probably twice what a farm labourer could earn. But in their situation, of course, they're in a remote area, like the North York Moors. There are no shops, there's no roads, no services at all. They're dependent on the contractor supplying their needs, food, bread, bacon, whatever, And of course the contractors exploited this. And one way that they exploited it was the navvies, a typical navvy's consumption, remember, it is doing very, very heavy physical work to a level that we find incredible today, and it was all digging and shoveling and whatever. The average navvy shifted 20 tons a day on the end of his shovel, every day, day in and day out. So you can imagine the amount of calories they needed to sustain that. beer was one of their sort of ways of drowning their sorrows in a way, and it was encouraged by the contractors as a way of exploiting the navvies. They became dependent. They drank on average about a gallon of beer a day, every day, but some would drink a lot more. But of course it had to be paid for. And the gangers, who were the contractors' foremen, if you like, some of them they employed their own navvies, but nevertheless, they were really in charge of the navvy gangs. They were often being bribed by local publicans, 5 shillings a barrel, to sell beer to the navvies. And in some cases, almost a condition of employment of the navvy was that he would agree to being sold, beer and whatever. And one of the problems was, again, it was a system designed really to exploit the navvies. Most navvy gangs were paid monthly. In extreme cases, it was 13 weeks. So you can imagine they haven't any money. They have to have their food and their drink on tick. And it's a chitty system known as a Tommy ticket system. So what the navvy does, he goes to his ganger and he says, I need a chit for more beer, I've no money. I'll pay at the end of the month when I get paid or whatever. So the ganger fills in a Tommy ticket to a certain value, and on this form we see that this is a true example of one of these Tommy tickets. A line being built in Scotland in 1846, and this guy, Mr. Govan, is obviously the storekeeper, and the ganger fills in this form at the request of Mr. whoever the thing is, but he's got a number, give him goods to the value of four shillings or whatever it was. And then, of course, it's signed. And the navvy then takes this to the company store, really. This is what it is. And in exchange for this chit, is given goods to the value that's on the chit. Now, of course, this was a license for the contractors and the gangers to exploit the navvies. So they bought poor food, cheap, and sold it at high prices and often short weight. So the poor navvies, getting the worst of all deals, is paying a high price for rubbish. And the term Tommy Rot comes from this bit of history. Tommy goods were Tommy Rot, and it's become an expression in the English language, that's a load of Tommy Rot. This became so bad that one contractor, he was operating a big rail building operation, obviously employing a few thousand navvies. By working this system, paying them, poor wages via this system, making them dependent on the Tommy ticket system, he made £150,000 extra profit in 1 month out of his labourers. And often what would happen is a contractor would bid to build a line, because it was all open to bidding competition, tenders. It would bid low, knowing it was not possible, it removed the competition by putting an unrealistic low bid in, and he'd make his money out of his navvies. I mean, it was really serious. Now, Parliament, with the Truck Act of 1831, they'd outlawed, some companies were printing their own coinage, but it was principally in the textile industry. They were printing their own coinage and notes, coinage really. And of course, again, that fastened the workers into their shops. They couldn't spend the money anywhere else but the company shop. So it was another way of robbing the workers again. And Parliament eventually outlawed it with the Truck Act, but it was too specific, and this was a problem with Parliament. So it only applied to the textile industry. And instead of making it general, then it left it wide open for the railways, the railway builders, the contractors to exploit. This went on right into the 1870s, unabated, no legislation to govern it, you know. So this was a situation that arrived during the building of the Rosedale Railway. The railway navvies were being paid quite exceptionally this time, weekly. 60 of them met in the Dudley Arms, and some of you will know the place, I've been there a few times, the Dudley Arms in Ingleby Greenhow, to be paid their wages. And when they arrived, the wages were principally in the form of Tommy tickets, a sort of IOU really. In other words, you know, we've got you absolutely tied. You're not going to get real money, you're going to get these things. And they rioted, and they trashed the Dudley Arms pub in Ingleby Greenhow. Police were out in force, and eventually 6 of them were labelled the ringleaders, and they were taken to the Northallerton Assize and tried in camera. The people who were the judiciary knew what was going on, and the press tried to get in to report on the trial and were barred. This was March 1860. And so this was the sort of thing that was happening here. And it happened during the building of the Rosedale Railway. And it just gives you an idea of the suffering that was entailed in the building of and the unfairness and the exploitation. But it was across the nation. Eventually, 6 of them were scapegoats, really. I mean, it was the contractors who should have been in court. 6 of them were labelled as ringleaders. 1 in particular, and he was given a chap called Henry Plankhook, and he was given 12 months hard labour. And hard labour, of course, was hard labour in those days. So back on the construction, you couldn't think of a more bleaker spot, could you? Now, it's 1860, it's winter, but I'd like to read you the weather report for 1860, and remember the navvies are working, all weathers, they don't stop when it rains. January 1860, continual cold, frost and rain. February, very high wind, very cold, much damage throughout the country. March, torrents of rain. April, snowstorm for a week. May the 28th, Whit Monday, terrific storm all over England. Terrible damage to shipping. Trees and chimneys blown down. 1 million sheep dead. Followed by the rainiest summer and autumn ever remembered. Snow fell during every month in Yorkshire except in July. All hay spoilt, no turnips. December 1860. And remember, they're still building the Rosedale Railway. Great frost and deep snow. River Tees frozen to a thickness of 13 inches. In Whitby, 8 ships ran aground, 3 were total wrecks, and all crews were lost. And that is a download from the Stokesley Local History Society. So we're talking local weather, and that was being built during those conditions. So we've moved a bit further on to a place called the Esclets. This is a track up from Westerdale. It crosses over the railway track and down the other side, and this side is the head of Farndale. When I took this photograph, it happened to be that there were heather burning, and it was fortuitous because it just looks as though it's a steam train approaching. And you can imagine that if you were walking on the moors in those years, you know, that would have been a fascinating sight. You're in the middle of nowhere, and there were pretty wild, open places with the North York moors, and there's a steam train approaching with empty wagons or whatever, you know. So we arrive at a place called the Esclets, And it was here that the railway company had established one of the watering holes for the locomotives, where they constantly, of course, have to top up the boilers. Here we see a typical structure, a brickwork structure, a concrete base on the top here, and then there'll be a big cast iron tank on the top there, and it was fed by streams from the moor, just relying on a head of water. You know, if the moor is, say, 100 feet higher up here, and they're tapping streams and guiding them into a collecting tank or a pipe system, and then there's enough head of pressure for the water to be forced into this storage tank here. And then when the locomotive pulls up and operates the water, what they call the water crane, then the gravity alone, of course, they don't need any electric pumps or motive power, they just use gravity. And this was the beauty of the Rosedale Railway. You know, everything worked by gravity. It wasn't costing anything to run. This is a photograph taken not by me, somebody in 1957 or somewhere about that time. And when I arrived on the scene, this is all I found. The traces of a brickwork structure and a bit of cast iron piping, and that's all that remained of that particular structure. Now, at this spot, or very close to this spot, the navvies also had some hutments. And January 1861, there was a massive snowstorm. There were 40 navvies trapped in the huts, and they ran out of fuel, heating logs, whatever they were burning. They ran out of food, and the rescue teams, you know, were finding it extremely difficult to reach them. They only just managed to get to them in time. They were in a bad way when the rescue teams arrived. And that was January 1861. But 40 navvies nearly expired, simply building the Rosedale line. And at this very place, I uncovered some lengths of rail. These stampings on here tell me this is iron rail. Steel rails weren't really coming into use in a big way until late 1870s. All the rails up to this time were iron rails. Steel rails lasted much longer. But it wasn't until the development of the Bessemer process that steel making on an economic scale could achieve the sort of production rates that they needed for producing masses and masses of steel rail. So when I examined the stampings on here, it was interesting to note the stampings told me that that length of rail was manufactured in 1874 and that it was manufactured in Concert, County Durham. And we know from the record that exclusively the Rosedale ironstone up to 1879 all went to Concert and Ferry Hill in County Durham. So it's quite likely that this piece of iron rail originated from the hillside at Rosedale, went up to Durham, got manufactured into iron rail, and came back into Rosedale. And it was such a find that I contacted the agent for the estate, had permission for this length of rail to be removed and cut up, and this section taken to the Beckile Museum and displayed with an explanatory note on it and everything. It was all arranged. My son-in-law was bringing a van with his men with still saws and goodness knows what, but there was a delay, and I talked too much, and somebody beat me to it. And when we got there, the rails had gone. Can you believe it? In the middle of nowhere, the rails had gone. Been there for 150 years. And I opened my big mouth and they disappeared. So who got them? I don't know. But we've lost a bit of history there. It's probably gone for scrap. So we're running parallel with the Farndale Valley. And here there's a sign that says LWW, Light Wake Walk. And the light wake walkers use this track and then they turn off here, go over the hill. It's part of their route. So we'll continue on, coming around the curve. Just up the top there is the Blakey Inn, the Lion at Blakey, and we're heading round here. We're running now parallel with the Moor Road, and we approach the one and only rail bridge on the line, and reasonably, I suppose, it was labelled Bridge Number 1. It had to be called Bridge Number 1, but it was the only one. So the locomotives passed on this side underneath the road bridge. The road, of course, went over the top, and they moved into Blakey Junction. We'll go there in due course, but first I want to take you off to the right. The track continues and it crosses the Farndale Road and it goes back onto the moor, because this is the line that was used to facilitate the removal of the ironstone from the Blakey mines, known really as the Farndale mines. So that's where we're going at the moment. So we've now crossed that road and we can still see the sleeper marks. Now this line was lifted about 1893 and we can see it's heading now across the moor and it's parallel with the Moor Road. That's the road past the Lion at Blakey from Castleton to Huttonley Hall. So we're heading parallel with that road, and this is a sketch of what it looked like this is the Castleton Road, and it did a dog leg. It did this sort over the bridge here, and then it went off to Huttonley Hall. So you've got this dog leg situation. This is a road going down to Farndale. The line that we've just talked about is this line here, and it's going across the moor, parallel with the Moor Road here. So it's only a short distance, actually, from the Moor Road. So here we are, rough terrain, hard job for the navvies. And we arrive at this strange structure. Now, this was what is termed a loading bridge. These blocks of sandstone were buttress walls, and across there would be a wooden trestle bridge. And tubs of ironstone from the Blakey mines would come up an incline, come along the top here, and railway wagons would be drawn up underneath, and then the side doors on the tubs of ironstone would be opened and the contents would fall into the open wagons. And on this side was a stationary steam winding engine which pulled the tubs up and down on the incline. It was in a brick-built hut, and obviously it was a stationary engine used as the means for hauling the tubs up from the mines below. And this is another view. We've reached the top of the right-hand buttress, and we're looking across. You can see a bit of the construction here, and sitting on the top there would be this brick building with the stationary winding engine, and of course the wooden loading bridge across the top here. And this was the site of where the hauling engine was. Now, looking again further along, we can see that the navvies have cut out quite an area for marshalling the wagons, the railway wagons. This is an incline, so what the engine bringing the wagons would do would it shunt a line of wagons up here, and they put the brakes on, probably even two, a couple of lines of wagons, and then the locomotive would depart, and as each empty wagon was needed, they would decouple and operate the manual braking system, run it down underneath the loading bridge, park it, load it, and then let it run on a bit and make it up into a set. And so they didn't have to have locomotives here shunting around all the time. They could simply put a row of wagons up here and bring them down one at a time as they needed them. All very ergonomically sensible and minimal sort of effort needed. So we'll move along a bit just to see to the end of this sort of marshalling area. There are some pits there. There's speculation because there were a lot of what they call moor coal pits along this area, especially around the area of Blakey and Danby. Moor coal was extensively mined, excavated, but actually there's quite a bit of quarrying here. This is what they call Freestone Sandstone. It was good quality, and once the railway was established, then of course it was a godsend because they could load it onto the wagons and it would be hauled off to places like Stockton, Middlesbrough, where it was in big demand for building harbours and stations and goodness knows what. So in all likelihood, this pit here was in fact a quarry. We see an old windlass. It's probably been there 150 years. These were fairly common in common use on farms. But in this case, they probably used it for hauling blocks of sandstone or pulling wagons or something like that. And obviously, it's going to be there for another 150 years, I think, at the rate. This is taken from the Ordnance Survey map of 1893. We can see the track that we've just been on for the parking of the railway wagons. Then there's an incline down here, a tramway, a narrow gauge tramway for the tubs of ironstone. And then along here, we have on the escarpment we're on the Farndale Valley side now. We had a section which was about a third of a mile in length, and it was here that the drift mines were operating, the so-called Blakey mines. There are about 6 drift mines operating. So we're going down this incline. This is where the tubs of ironstone would be hauled up from the area that they were being filled and onto the loading bridge. So we're going to walk down and go along this tree line to see the source of the ironstone. So we've come down the incline, we've walked to the end of the tree line, and we're now onto an escarpment where it's been opened out. This is a sort of working ledge, really. Bit of a mess now, but in those days, of course, it would be all cleared out and there'd be a tramway here. And we can see that's towards the head of Farndale, and the railway would make its way round this way that we've just seen earlier, and coming round to the Blakey side. We've proceeded a bit further round, and here we see the working terrace. On this side, you can just make out that this is an entrance, has been an entrance to one of the drifts. It's either been blown up or it's collapsed. But when you examine the ground there, it's clearly been an entrance route to one of the drifts. And here we see still the sleeper mark of the narrow gauge tramway, probably a 2-foot gauge tramway. And here we can see an entrance to a drift. Now that was a trial drift. It didn't go anywhere much, and they were probably just exploring to see, was it any good at this section here? And that's the working terrace. The Blakey mines were not an economic success. They operated from about 1873 to, well, it's problematical, but certainly not beyond 1893. That is really sort of probably exaggerating it. The production from these mines was very hit and miss. They were working in the Dogger Seam. They assumed, I suppose reasonably at the time, that because Rosedale had got this Klondike find of this amazing ironstone, quite a unique, never satisfactorily been explained yet. There's no definitive geological explanation as to why Rosedale had this very superior quality ironstone. And it was reasonable to suppose that, well, if Rosedale had it, Farndale next door, they must have it. So, of course, they were digging away hoping they'd find it. They never did. And the chap who sponsored it, who funded it, was a chap called Robert P. Lavery. He was a Manchester businessman. Now, he must have known fairly early on that this was not going to be a success. But what we thought he was up to was that he was based in Manchester, he was a successful businessman, and the trick was that you persuaded people who were not in this area but had heard about it, that the whole of Cleveland and the North York moors were sitting on solid blocks of ironstone, and it was just invest your money with me and we'll make a fortune. So really what he was doing was selling shares. And he was making his money not out of ironstone, but out of selling shares. And of course, there were lots of small-scale iron companies that formed and then went bankrupt, and the investors, of course, lost the money. Many of these investors were down south and had heard these fantastic stories about, you know, this fantastic iron industry up on Teesside, which it was true, was quite incredible, and it was easy to persuade them to invest their money. And we think Mr. Lavery was up to the same trick. So we've reached the end of the work in Terrace, and we'll now make our way back to the Blakey Junction. So back up the incline, and we've reached that road bridge. So let's have a look at the road bridge, because lots and lots of people must have parked there and never bothered even to look over the parapet, and never even thought about it, and never believed that it was a railway bridge. So let's have a look. This is the road that leads down into Farndale, and many of you will probably be going down there to see the daffodils when they finally come out. So here we are at the road bridge. You can see the parapet, this parapet's been knocked down. The council straightened out the road in about 1954-55. They knocked it around, filled all this in, and straightened the road out. So instead of doing the dog leg as it did before, it now goes straight across. And there's convenient parking. You can see some cars there. It's convenient parking area around there. And if you take the trouble to wander across the road and peer over the parapet, that's what you'll see. So we're looking over that parapet, and here we see the run-in goes underneath the road bridge, and that's the track that we've come along. But this is the track now that we're interested in. So one more look at the bridge, a bit more closer to, and this photograph shows we're now looking from the other side, the Blakey Junction side, and we see it's a poor quality photograph, but remember when these were taken, you know, 1890s or whatever, cameras and film wasn't up to much anyway, and we're very, very lucky to have these. A locomotive setting off with a rake of wagons from the cottages at Blakey Junction and heading to go underneath the bridge that we've just had a look at. This is the only known photograph of the road bridge at the time that it was operating, and of clearly they're having some problems with snow. This, in all probability, was taken round about 1916-17, which was a particularly difficult year for snow drifts. And we've got a couple of engines here with a snow plough. You can't see the snow ploughs here somewhere, and there's a mountain of snow that's being moved. And that's the only known photograph that we have of the one and only bridge on the Rosedale Railway. So here we see where the council have blocked it or filled it all in. We're now on the Blakey side, and this was the track, the route of the track. And another view here, we're looking where the locomotives would emerge, and here on this cleared site was the small, I suppose you could call it a hamlet, of 7 cottages, railway cottages, which were Blakey Junction. You'll hear some people or some writings say that these cottages were occupied by miners. They weren't. They were absolutely railway employees. The Blakey miners, the Farndale miners, they lived in hutments down almost opposite where the working terrace was, by the tree line, just below the tree line there, about 18 hutments. And they were there until just after the end of the First World War. This is Blakey taken about 1890, 7 cottages, and these were all occupied by railwaymen. Here we see the line that runs, the bridge is just round out of sight on this curve here, and this train is already organised, ready to go to the incline top with wagons loaded with ironstone. Off to the right is the route down to the East Mines, but right now we're heading down to eventually Banktop on Rosedale west side. These cottages, this was a photograph of those self-same cottages taken in August 1955. Now, they're pretty wrecked, but you can see, you know, they're quite substantial cottages. They were all demolished. If they'd been left and rebuilt, they'd be worth an absolute fortune, because the views from these cottages is superb. And it is a pity that they were all knocked down. I'll tell you, they'd be worth, you know, literally a fortune. So let's have a quick look at the 1893 Ordnance Survey. That's the track that we've been on for the Farndale mines, for the loading bridge, etc. This is the road, the Moor Road, and this is we've come underneath the railway bridge here, and we've come to Blakey Junction. Now, there was a siding known as the Farmer's Siding. There was also one of these farmers' sidings at Glowworth Crossing, by the way, as well. But there's a siding here known as the Farmer's Siding, and supplies for Farndale, agricultural supplies and stuff like that, were often brought by the railway and parked here and collected by the Farndale and others from the Blakey Junction. And this is the route that takes us to the head of Rosedale and then down the other side to the east side. But we're heading down here now. There was serious talk and plans were drawn up in 1864 for what is known as a curve. They were going to build a curve because at this stage, 1864, they were starting to build a spur line that would take them to the East Mines. And the idea was that locomotives would arrive from the East Mines with their wagons of ironstone and simply come round the curve and head off down to Ingleby Incline and eventually to Concert and wherever. For some reason, and it must have been an expense thing, they decided they wouldn't do that, and they would simply bring the wagons, the trains up, and do what they call a runaround. So they'd park the wagons here, and the locomotive would detach and run round to what was the back of the train, and then couple up and set off for the Ingleby Incline. When the wagons were loaded, the locomotives had to lead. They couldn't go in reverse. The locomotive's brakes and the brake van were the only brakes that they had on the system. Not like the modern trains, which every carriage has its own braking system. The only braking available was from the locomotive and the brake van at the back. So that was the policy. They could shunt empty wagons in reverse as long as they were empty, but full wagons always, as I say, the locomotive always had to lead. So this is the site where the cottages were. There's evidence of brickwork and a few drain covers, obviously septic tank covers and things like that, but that's all. So we're heading off, and we're heading down to a place called Banktop. But on the way, I just want to show you some interesting bits and pieces. Now, again, the railway company and the builders of the railway were very enterprising, and again, they harnessed nature. They needed another watering hole for the locomotives. So what they did was they established another place where locomotives could fill up their boilers or their tenders. We're about 2 miles down from Blakey Junction, the cottages that we've just seen. We've moved 2 miles down, and we've climbed up that sloping moorland, and we see the ruins of what was a farmhouse, and it was called Sled Shoe. The railway took it over, and they put a railwayman in there. It was obviously livable in then. It wasn't quite the ruin it is now. And his principal job, was to make sure that streams fed into a reservoir that supplied water to the water crane that would supply the locomotives. And that was his main job. He probably did a bit of track work as well, but his main job was ensuring that at all times the streams feeding the reservoir were flowing freely and water was available for the locomotives. So let's have a look at this reservoir that you won't see unless you actually climb up onto the moor. Hundreds of people do this walk and have no idea this reservoir exists. And there it is. The railway dug that, and it's still working today, and streams fed into it, looked after by the railwayman who was living in Sled Shoe, and then this in turn, there's a height of water here, I don't know what it is, probably 80, 90 feet. So there's a water pressure, so by the time it reaches the water crane, of course, it's a decent pressure. So there's no problems about pumping it or anything like that. And here we see a locomotive have stopped at the watering hole. Now, unfortunately, just off the picture is the watering crane. And the chances are that there was no brick structure, there was no special building there. They relied on the reservoir and the head of pressure that provided to feed directly down to this iron water crane. This is the Battersby Junction, and you can see one of the water cranes there, still there, and they're thinking of resurrecting it and using it. Now, the water tank feeding that water crane is over here somewhere. The water tower is over here. And there's a mains that runs underneath the railway and feeds water to this water crane here. And the same idea would be working in the case that we've just seen, the Sled Shoe reservoir. There's no need to build a building with a tank on top because you've already got it with the reservoir. Now I took to the air. I wanted to take some aerial photographs, and I got a tour in Peter Jackson's Tiger Moth. That's got a history of its own. We were doing anti-submarine patrols in January in 1939. Open cockpit, no radio, and it was flying over the North Sea looking for U-boats. I mean, that's how we went to war in 1939. Anyway, I flew in it, and the passenger sits in the front seat, and the blast of air, trying to take photographs, and you've only got this little tiny windscreen, and you're trying to put your camera to the side and take photographs, but it's really difficult. Anyway, so this is an aerial photograph. We've moved down Sledge Shoe, we've just talked about, and it's somewhere here. This is a track, and it gives you some idea of the terrain. And this is the Rosedale Valley. And we're heading down here, and just off the picture is what is known as Sheriff Pitt. And the Thorgill mines that supplied Sheriff Pitt are down here, on this terrace here. The drifts went underneath the moor to Sheriff's Pitt. So we're heading on the track bed, and we can just see some remains in the distance. And we arrive at the site of Sheriff Pitt. Now, this is what you would have seen when it was operating. It closed in 1911, and it was demolished very quickly. It had started operating, well, really 1857, but until the railway came, of course, it was just cartloads of ironstone, nothing much at all. Once the railway was established, then it got cracking. And so here we are with a fully fledged, that's the mine manager's house, winding engine here, pit head gear, and what is known as the heapstead, where the ironstone was weighed off and then tipped into railway wagons which were drawn up on lines underneath the heapstead. And this is all that remains. There's even less of it now, but this is all remains of the mine manager's house. Now, I was told that if I examined the cement rendering carefully, I would find it was full of bullet holes. And so I took a close-up photo, and sure enough, there's 20mm cannon shell holes and .5 rounds and goodness knows what here. And of course, during World War II, the whole of the North Yorkshire moors were given over to army manoeuvres and training for D-Day. And it was very, very extensive. I mean, there were live tank firing exercises, mortar rounds, there was aircraft strafing. I was told aircraft did strafe the buildings, what was Sheriff's Pitt, or the remaining buildings at the time. And sure enough, you know, these are bullet holes, there's no question about it. And so it gives you an insight into what it must have been like on those moors during wartime. I know the village where I come from, a huge amount of army operation and tank manoeuvres and goodness knows what during wartime. So this is a close-up of Sheriff Pitt, and it's actually during the closure period. They've brought all the tubs up, mining tubs up, and it's being dismantled, everything's being scrapped. It's come to the end of its life. But let's just have a look inside. So this is a graphic I've drawn to show you what was happening. The work in Terrace, a bit like the Blakey mines, they were putting drifts into the hillside and excavating ironstone from what is known as the Dogger seam. And it wasn't bad quality on the Rosedale side. For Dogger, it was quite a good, reasonable quality ironstone. They constructed a tramway route 1,500 feet long to the bottom of the site where the pithead gear was erected and sank a shaft. The shaft 270 feet deep. And it is mistakenly believed by some people that this was a shaft mine. It wasn't. It was simply a shaft sunk to facilitate the easy extraction of ironstone tubs into a heapstead for weighing off and then loading into railway wagons. To take that up over the moor, the rough moor, would have been a nightmare of a job. It was so easy to trundle it through underneath the moor and then haul it direct to surface. So that's all it was there for. It wasn't the worst shaft mines in the Cleveland area, North Skelton, Kilton, they were all shaft mines. But this one, the Sheriff Pitt, was simply to facilitate easy loading into railway trucks. And here we see a rare photograph poor quality, but nevertheless we're very, very grateful to have it. We see a tub of ironstone which has come up the shaft and has been weighed off. That arrangement there, it sits in a sort of cradle. As it comes out of the lift, sits in a cradle and it's weighed off. And there'll be somewhere here is a blurred photograph, but there was a checker, a weigh checker, and he was paid by the miners to check the weight of every tub of ironstone that came up that shaft, because if they didn't have their own independent check, they were often cheated, you know. So the miners would be sending tubs of ironstone up that weren't being booked to them. So again, you know, they couldn't trust the employers, so they paid their own man permanently to be there and independently record every tub of ironstone that came up to verify that the miners were being paid. Every tub of ironstone would carry a metal disc with the identity of the miner who'd filled it. Interesting, have a look at those lumps of ironstone. I mean, talk about making sure it's full. Just look at it. That's the limit of the metalwork of the tub. And look at that, the way it's piled up, and the size of those blocks of ironstone. They really did load them up. So normally that tub would hold probably 1,300 weight, maybe 2,500 weight. There's probably 2.5 tons in there. This is the edge capping round the shaft. It's guarded by link fencing. Unbelievably, the landowner has great trouble. People habitually use wire cutters and goodness knows what to get in, to break through the wire security fence and stand on the lip of the shaft to peer in. The shaft is flooded, but if you fell in there, there's no hope whatsoever. You'll never get out. And if you stood on that lip there, you can see where the soil erosion is taking place and it's gradually being undermined. And eventually, they'll fall in as well. And if you just happen to be standing on there when it's due to fall in, you'll go with it. And it's unbelievable that people will do something as stupid as that, cut the wire to get in and stand and probably throw stones in or something like that. So I've gone down onto that face, the moor face, to have a look at the working terrace. This is the working terrace for the so-called Thorgill mine that fed the Sheriff Pitt area. And we can see a bit, there's been some subsidence of course, but the working terrace would be along here. There'll be various drifts. And here we can see an entrance into a drift, but it's all collapsed. Now, interestingly, I've got a friend who, as a lad in the 1940s and 50s, lived in Rosedale, and the drifts were open. Thorgill, East Mines, kids were going in there. And they're so extensive that you can simply get lost in there. But it's dangerous also, of course, from the possibility of roof falls and things like that. But kids were habitually going into the mines. And the parents in the area petitioned, and it was decided that the entrances to all the mines would be blown up. And a team came in, and they were quarrymen who had explosive licenses and used to operate in explosives. And they systematically went round and blew all the shafts, drift entrances in. And Barry remembers that clearly. You know, there were explosions obviously, and he remembers as a lad that happening. He reckoned round about 1951, 2, or thereabouts. So it's highly likely that this gelignite was used to blow this in. Here we see a group of miners in a typical drift entrance. This is one of the Thorgill mines. Notice the shovels. They were men's shovels were those. They didn't mess about. And here we see the remains of one. You'd know if you'd got a block of ironstone on the end of that. Just another lead in to one of the drifts. I'm climbing back up now from the Thorgill mines onto the track bed because we're approaching a bank top. Just note this culvert here, this drainage culvert. It's about 157 years now since that was built, since this track bed was established. And that culvert probably has never had any attention at all, and it works perfectly, sound as a pound. And it's because the drainage system was so well engineered that the track bed has lasted so well. It's in remarkably good condition. It's only the head of Rosedale where it's pretty ropey, but the rest of it is amazing, and it's superb walking. If you've never walked on the Rosedale track bed, it's excellent, and the views are some of the best in this country. This was remarkable. It was a frosty morning, and I was approaching Bank Top, and the circumstances, the atmospherics, the frost and everything, produced this almost like a photographic negative. So here we have the traces of the sleepers that existed when this line was operating. What is it, 80 odd years since it closed? And it's obviously chemicals that have leached out, principally sort of creosote and stuff, that has leached out into the ground from the sleepers over many, many years. And it shows through in certain atmospheric conditions, almost like a photographic negative. And it's quite remarkable, after all these years, 157 years since it was built, you know, that you get this almost photographic negative image. So here we're arriving at Bank Top. This was the site of the engine shed, and there were pits here for servicing the engine, dropping the ashes and all the rest of it. It was a two-road engine shed, and here was the base for a coaling crane. This is the site where there were originally 16 railway cottages. It was a very busy operation here. There were 5 steam locomotives permanently stabled up on the moor, permanently stable. That's how much activity was going on, 5 locomotives. And would you believe, at Battersby Junction, the complement was 9 permanently stationed at Battersby Junction. So you can see the operation was a very active and busy operation. There are only 4 cottages left now of the 16 that were originally there. But had we been there in earlier times, this would be a typical site. There's the engine shed. We've seen the base, we've just seen the base of it. There's the engine shed. A 2-road engine shed. It would hold 4 steam locomotives. This one particularly we know all about. Its number was 1129. It was called Stanley. It came up onto the moor very early on, probably 1863, thereabouts, and it finally left the moor in 1905. So it was up there from 1863 to 1905. And then it went to Blythe. It was shedded at Blythe, and in 1909 it was finally scrapped. They were a successful design of engine. It was what is known as a long-boilered 060, designed by a chap called William Booch, who worked for the Stockton Darlington, the chief engineer for Stockton Darlington Railway. And they built hundreds of these. They were a successful locomotive. And originally, the North Eastern Railway Company had hired from the Stockton Darlington Railway, Stockton Darlington Railway, hired these locomotives, but as I mentioned earlier in the last talk, by 1863-4, the North Eastern Railway Company had grown to such a powerful company that they bought out the Stockton Darlington, who were their main competitor, and of course all the locomotives and lock, stock and barrel. So, you know, it all became part of the North Eastern Railway Company. Here's 1893 Ordnance Survey map. They're the 16 cottages, the engine shed, and various sort of sidings. They had coal cells because, of course, local coal merchants now could get Durham coal brought to them by the Rosedale Railway, far better than the Moor coal. The Moor coal was very poor quality, and of course, once the railway was established, they had access to Durham coal, and that was brought in, and of course, coal merchants were having a great time, you know, Huttonley Hall and Rosedale and wherever. Here we see the site of the winding engine and the incline down to the mines. This line here were coal cells at there. This is the road that comes from Huttonley Hall down Chimney Bank into Rosedale, and these lines were really sidings, and the coal cells for the coal merchants were here, and of course they came by road with their wagons and collected their coal supplies, and off they went to Huttonley Hall or wherever. But we're interested in this route now down to the mines. This is an aerial shot taken in 1967, when I get it right. Here we see the site of the stationary winding engine. That is again, it's the water supply. It's a reservoir fed by moorland streams that fed water to the steam winding engine that was parked somewhere, well, just about here actually. Steam winding engine that was used to haul the tubs of ironstone up from the Hollins mines. And this was the famous Rosedale chimney. In an act of pure vandalism, it was knocked down in 1972 with the connivance of the National Park. It wouldn't be allowed now, but it was then. And it had been almost like a tourist attraction for many, many years, and there was outrage when it was knocked down, on the pretext that it was unsafe. Actually, it wouldn't have taken much. It needed a bit of pointing and a bit of repair, and a group of citizens had formed to do just that, to raise funds, to have it all repaired and put back into fettle, and they were beaten to it, and it was pulled down. This road here is known as Chimney Bank Road. It was originally built by the mining company. It's maintained now, obviously, by the North Yorkshire Highways. But at the time, it was the mining company built this. And the incline went underneath the road, sort of like a bridge arrangement, where the road ran over the top, and the incline tramway went down to the Hollins mines. This is the incline down to the Hollins mines, which are just out of sight round the corner, half a mile long, and the two deposits, remarkable deposits of so-called magnetic ironstone. Now, its chemical name is magnetite. For the chemists amongst you, it's Fe3O4. And it's recorded in the records as having an iron content of around, at peak, of 60% iron. So for every ton you mine, you're getting something like 60%. A friend of mine had some samples analysed in the last few years by modern methods. This is proper metallurgical analysis. It's over 71% iron content. Unbelievable. The iron content is so high that the raw stone as mined will attract a simple magnet. Now, you can't do that with any other ironstone mined in Cleveland. The bulk of the ironstone mined in Cleveland is FeO, ferrous oxide. It's the poorest form of ironstone. At best, 32%, but averaging less than 30%. But there's a lot of it, and it was easy to get. So it still made it economic. The Essen Hills were just a godsend. It was on site, it was handy, it was easy to get, and there was masses and masses. I mean, the Essen mine, over its life of 99 years, provided something like 63 million tonnes of ironstone out of the Essen Hills. They say the Essen Hills have dropped 6 feet since they started mining it. But this magnetic ironstone, it was so-called magnetite, is quite remarkable. 2 big deposits, and in all told, there was something like 3 million tonnes of taken out there. And it was fetching twice the price of ordinary ironstone. So it was an economic bonanza.